Hello, and welcome to the Natural Selection Podcast, the conservation podcast brought to you by the University of Exeter's Biosciences Master students. Your hosts for today are Deborah Kornblut and
Catherine Lee Hing. Today's episode was recorded during the Terrestrial Biodiversity field course trip to Kew Gardens in London in October 2019. We spent several days meeting with plant conservation experts and exploring the Botanical Gardens.
And who else better to explain global plant conservation than the head of conservation science at Kew Gardens, Dr. Colin P Club.
So today we're joined by Dr. Colin P Club, the head of conservation science at Kew Gardens. Thank you for joining us, Colin.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking.
For our listeners, to start off, if you had to create a book title summarizing your research, what would it be?
There's a challenge to start off with, but maybe it would be something like plant conservation in the tropics, solutions and perspectives. Something like that, I think.
And what has been the most surprising aspect of either your research or conducting your research in the tropics, working with these diverse plants or these diverse groups of people?
Surprising. It's interesting to think about what's surprising. I think what's interesting is that I've managed to carve out a career and I'm still working in plant conservation, which is great. I didn't necessarily start out. I started out perhaps more as a botanist, a field ecologist. But the more I looked at the status of plants in the wild, the more I thought, well, actually, I really need to try and understand and then try and do something about the declining status of plants and habitats. So in a sense, I think the surprising thing now is that I probably spend as much time discussing plant conservation with policymakers or with decision makers than I do with perhaps fellow academics or students, which is where I started out. I started out in a university context, now working at Kew as a sort of a research organisation, but very much one focused on practical solutions. I find that a lot of my time is really debating and trying to understand and trying to understand the other person's perspective. And that other person might be poles apart from my own view in terms of someone who is sitting in government where, well, conservation or environment, let alone plant conservation, is really just not on their radar because they're focused more on development or education or sanitation, some of the big challenges for development. But we need to make sure that plant conservation is part of that debate because there are so many potential solutions for many of these challenges in the plant world and in the maintenance and the security of wild species diversity.
Since you've been working in this field for a long time, and usually plant conservation seems to be either undervalued or at least in many of the talks we heard how there's a lot of funding that isn't really given to plants and more focused on mammals. How would you say that either the knowledge or conservation of different plant species has changed throughout your time in this career?
Well, I think certainly it's not that many years ago where I think that would be the case, that the conservation, if someone mentioned conservation, you were talking about conservation of whales, rhinos, elephants. I think now at least people are understanding that there is a context to that where plants form the basis of habitats, the basis of food chains and food webs, and that we need to take a more holistic view of the environment at a kind of ecosystem level or how interrelated species are. So I think that's been a change, and that's, I think, been a very good change. And then when you start looking at the whole habitat, then you start thinking of functions as well. And of course, from a purely selfish human point of view, we start thinking of, so what functions are they providing for us, the whole arena of natural capital or ecosystem services. So I think there has been this gradual move perhaps away from single species to that more functional view. And I think that's been a positive one. But we mustn't lose the species focus in that matrix.
As a global research center, Kew gets a lot of experts from around the world, and you have a lot of research topics in different places. And I was just wanting to know more about kind of how you balance the ethical implications of working in these very biodiverse locations where usually the population is more impoverished, but at the same time not coming in with the colonialist mindset of just going in and dictating what they should be doing to protect their biodiversity, but to conserve their resources for them and for the natural environment?
That's a very good question and a key debating point today. And interesting, I think, very appropriately you brought it up at somewhere like Kew, because our origins, Kew was set up as a botanic garden specifically to exploit useful plants from the British Empire. And that's exactly what we did. Today, though, now we obviously recognise that history and recognise the world that we are part of. And that's why I think the policy context is so important, because from the Convention on Biological Diversity, right from when it was first came into force in 1992, the central thesis there was that genetic resources are national sovereignty. They are the national sovereignty of that country, and that we should be implementing conservation through these three key objectives. So conservation, sustainable use, and fair and equitable benefit sharing. And that's something that Kew really embraced right from the original signing of that. We have, and unusual for a botanic garden, we have some qualified environmental lawyers on our staff. And one of them in particular, who you met during the course here, China Williams, is a specialist in access and benefit sharing. And we very much have that central. And then the other thing that Kew is so important is partnership relationship. We build long-term partnerships. There are some parts of the world that we've been working for over 100 years, and we take a long-term view, and it is genuine partnership. So the wonderful thing about also working at Kew through this partnership approach is that we get lots of visitors here from countries that we're working. There's always, particularly in the herbarium, the building I'm based in, the same in our other science buildings, visitors from our partners who are coming here for a short period, maybe to do a course, maybe to work one-on-one with a researcher, maybe just to help focus their own research project and use the resources that we have here. And we do joint fundraising to get them here. Today, our science is very much done in a collaborative way within this very clear ethical framework.
What do you see as the future of plant conservation?
Well, I hope the future of plant conservation is positive, that we're able to really apply the techniques and the learning and the information that we've got to actually improve the outlook for plants into the future, and that we can turn views of people that plants, indeed biodiversity, is there as a source that they can mine and just use, to actually thinking about this is something we have to be thinking about how we use it and making sure that we leave enough behind so the next generation can benefit from what we're benefiting.
What advice would you give us in the long run? Where does plant conservation go from here?
Advice for you is potentially as the next generation of plant conservationists going forward.
And then for others as well.
Okay, well, for that, I would say continue to remain curious. Continue to ask questions, challenge norms. I think, you're a bright set of students. I've really enjoyed interacting with you while you've been here. The questions that you've asked, the debates that we've managed to pull together after sessions has been great. And I would say actually really taking that approach, don't just accept things, because I think we get into ruts. We all do that in particular disciplines, or if you're doing something in a particular way. And it takes those new people coming in, yourselves, once you've graduated from this program, or you may go on to do a PhD and then, or something very practical, wherever it is, it's that being curious, asking questions. Where is the evidence? We are scientists. We shouldn't be making decisions unless we've got the evidence to support those decision making. Otherwise, we start to move into this whole area. One of the most surprising thing, coming back to your earlier question perhaps, that I feel at the moment is how now there is a currency in fake news. And that is a worrying trend for humanity. It started in politics, but it's now being used in science as well. I don't like the sound of that, so I'm going to trash it. So again, I think it's being very clear, objective, making sure we can pull that evidence. And I think one of the things that we try very hard here at Kew as an institution, and that makes us quite different, say, from an NGO, is we're not an advocacy organisation. I think advocacy has a place, and NGOs and community groups do it great because they have exactly, they've got something they're following, something they're passionate about, and almost a wrong they're trying to right. For Kew, I think what our power is, and similar institution, is that kind of independent expertise without that advocacy element. And our researchers are trying to tackle global problems, look at where there are plant-based solutions for those global problems, and then provide the evidence so that our decision makers can say, well, this is such compelling evidence, this is the trajectory we need to go on. So I think that would be sort of the advice I'd like to share with you guys as the excitement. That's one of the lovely things about being associated with this program, and we have been since it started, is because I can see that that the future of plant conservation, well, the future of biodiversity conservation is in safe hands going forward, when we've got people like yourselves going to be graduating and are going to be asking those questions, are going to be challenging for those roles, and that hopefully part of being here as well, we can shine a light onto how important plants are.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. This has been great and really awesome to highlight some of the amazing work that Kew does.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and thanks for visiting us at Kew, and come back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. Tune in next time for part 1 of our 2-part Kenya series.